My name is Mahmoud Al-Khair. On June 14th, 2024, I was 22 years old, living in a cramped third-floor apartment in Dearborn, Michigan. It was a Friday, and the humidity was that thick, Midwestern weight that makes your clothes feel like they're made of lead. I wasn't doing anything remarkable. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a half-eaten bowl of lentils and a stack of medical school applications that felt more like death warrants than dreams. My father, a man whose hands were permanently stained with motor oil from the shop, was in the other room. I could hear the rhythmic murmur of his prayers. It was a sound that usually anchored me, but that afternoon, it felt like a frequency I could no longer tune into. The headache didn't start as a pain. It started as a sound, a high-pitched, metallic ringing, like a wet finger circling the rim of a crystal glass. I reached for my water, but my fingers didn't close. I watched my hand pass right through the glass, or so it seemed, before knocking it over. The water spilled across my applications, soaking the word ambition in a dark, jagged stain. Then came the heat. It wasn't the external heat of the Michigan summer. It was an internal, chemical burn starting in the base of my skull. I tried to call out for my father, but my tongue felt like a dry piece of leather pinned to the roof of my mouth. I felt a sharp, electric pop behind my left eye. Medical textbooks call it a subarachnoid hemorrhage, a literal explosion of a weakened vessel. To me, it felt like my brain was being folded in half. I hit the linoleum floor before I even realized I had stood up. The impact was dull, distant. I remember the smell of the floor wax and the sight of a stray Cheerio under the radiator. My vision began to tunnel, the edges fraying into a static-filled gray. I heard my father's chair scrape against the floor in the next room. "Omar," he called. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, rusted well. I wanted to tell him I was sorry for the mess on the table, but the darkness climbed my throat and swallowed the thought whole. The transition wasn't a tunnel or a sudden leap. It was a series of jagged, sensory snapshots. I remember the cold, the absolute, bone-shattering cold of the ambulance. The paramedic's name tag said Miller. He was sweating, his face a mask of practiced, frantic neutrality. He was shoving a plastic tube down my throat, and I felt the scrape against my trachea, but there was no gag reflex. I was hovering somewhere near the ceiling of the rig, looking down at my own body. My skin looked like gray parchment. I looked small. I had always thought of myself as a big man, broad-shouldered like my uncles, but from up there, I looked like a discarded suit. When we hit the emergency bay at Beaumont Hospital, the world turned into a strobe light of fluorescent blue and clinical white. The noise was a chaotic symphony of crashing metal and barked orders. "GCS is a 3, someone shouted. I knew what that meant, the Glasgow Coma Scale. A 3 is as low as it goes. It means you're a vegetable. It means you're gone. I watched a resident named Dr. Aris throw his weight onto my chest for compressions. I heard the distinct, sickening crack of my sternum giving way. It didn't hurt, but the sound was visceral, a private violation of the body I had spent 22 years inhabiting. My mother was there suddenly, held back by a nurse near the double doors. She wasn't screaming. She was doing something much worse. She was chewing on her knuckles, her eyes wide and dry, staring at the mess of wires and blood that used to be her son. I reached out to touch her shoulder, to tell her that the cold wasn't as bad as it looked, but my hand passed through the air like smoke through a screen door. I felt a sudden, violent pull, not upward, but inward. The hospital room didn't fade, it fractured. The walls peeled back like burnt paper, revealing not a void, but a terrifying, brilliant clarity. The monitor's long, continuous beep followed me into the silence, a flat line that became the only heartbeat I had left. I wasn't in a garden, and I wasn't in the clouds. I was standing in a place that felt like the very center of a mountain, solid, ancient, and impossibly heavy. The air didn't move, yet it felt alive, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. I was alone, or so I thought, until the light changed. It wasn't a flash. It was as if the atmosphere itself decided to become visible. And then he was there. He wasn't the soft, ethereal figure from the Sunday school posters I'd seen in the windows of the churches downtown. He was a man, looking to be in his 30s, wearing a garment that looked like woven coarse wool, stained with the dust of a long road. But it was his eyes that stopped the breath I didn't need to take. They weren't blue or brown. They were the color of a furnace at its peak intensity, white-hot and utterly honest. I knew him instantly, not from a book, but from a deep, cellular recognition. ISA, Jesus. I felt a sudden, crushing shame. I thought of my prayers, my heritage, the walls I had built around my heart to keep the other out. I fell to my knees, but the ground wasn't hard. It felt like kneeling on the collective memory of every person who had ever lived. He didn't speak with his mouth at first. The communication was a direct download into my consciousness, bypassing the ears entirely. Omar, he said. The sound of my name in his voice felt like it was being stitched back into my soul. I looked up, expecting a lecture or a condemnation, but he was looking past me, back toward the world I had just left. He looked grieved, not for my death, but for something much larger. He reached out a hand, and I saw the scar in his wrist. It wasn't a clean surgical mark. It was a jagged, ugly crater of a wound, a reminder of a physical reality I had always treated as a metaphor. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and the heat from his skin was the first time I felt warm since the vessel popped in my brain. There is a veil being woven, he said, and his voice carried the weight of a falling star. And you are going to see who is holding the needle. The weight of his hand on my shoulder didn't feel like a ghostly touch. It felt like a physical anchor. Jesus didn't pull me up. He waited for me to find my footing in this new, heavy reality. Look back, Omar, he said, and his voice lacked any hint of the rhythmic, chanting quality I had grown up equating with holiness. It was the voice of a man standing in a storm, clear and unwavering. I turned, and the hospital room, the scene of my own death, was no longer a solid place. It was a translucent layer of film, like a soap bubble stretched thin. I saw my father sitting in the waiting room, his head in his hands, his prayer beads moving through his fingers with a frantic, desperate speed. But as I watched, the air around him began to thicken with something dark and oily. It wasn't smoke, and it wasn't a shadow. It was a shimmering, distorted field of energy that looked like heat rising off an asphalt road. I saw a man walk past my father, a hospital chaplain, wearing a small silver cross and carrying a clipboard. To anyone in the physical world, he looked like a messenger of comfort. But through the eyes Jesus was giving me, I saw the shimmering oil clinging to the chaplain's tongue. Every word he spoke to my father, words about God's plan and peace, came out as a gray, suffocating vapor that wrapped around my father's throat, tightening with every syllable. The deception isn't in the hatred, Omar, Jesus said, his voice vibrating in my chest. The deception is in the comfort that requires no change. I watched as the chaplain patted my father's shoulder, and I saw a thin, black thread stitch itself from the chaplain's sleeve into my father's skin. It was a spiritual tether, a lie masquerading as a blessing. I tried to scream, to tell my father to move, to shake off the hand, but the barrier between us was absolute. I realized then that the peace the world offers is often just a sedative for the soul. The tension in the room wasn't just grief. It was a silent, invisible war where the weapons were soft words and hollow rituals. The scene shifted. We weren't in the hospital anymore. We were standing on the corner of West Warren Avenue, right in the heart of my neighborhood. It was the middle of the day, but the sun looked different. It was a cold, white disk that revealed everything. I saw the grocery store where I bought my milk, the bank where I had my meager savings, and the mosque where I had spent my Fridays. But the people walking the streets weren't just people. They were carrying heavy, invisible crates on their backs, labeled with things like safety, tradition, and inheritance. Jesus walked among them, but no one saw him. He stopped in front of a young man I recognized, Youssef, a guy I'd played soccer with since we were 10. Youssef was looking at his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. In the spiritual clarity of this vision, I could see what Youssef was actually looking at. It wasn't just social media. It was a complex web of digital approval. Every like, every shared post about justice or faith was another thin, golden chain wrapping around his wrists. He was building a prison out of his own reputation. I watched as a prominent local leader approached Youssef. The leader was smiling, his teeth bright, his suit expensive. He spoke about protecting our community and standing firm against the outsiders. As he spoke, I saw the deception the title of my story promised. Behind the leader's back, he was holding a knife made of frozen tears, and he was carving pieces of Youssef's shadow away, feeding them into a small, black box he carried. He sells the identity to buy the influence, Jesus said, his eyes burning with that terrifying, white-hot honesty. He tells them they are safe in their heritage while he eats the very foundation of their house. This is the deception of the gatekeepers. They lock the doors from the inside and tell you the key is lost. The vision narrowed until the street faded, and I was standing in my own apartment. It was 3 weeks into the future. I saw my mother sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had collapsed. She looked 10 years older. My father wasn't there. I saw a letter on the table, the official letterhead of the bank. Foreclosure. My death hadn't just left a hole in their hearts. It had triggered a financial collapse. My father had used my medical school savings to pay for a spiritual cleansing promised by a man who claimed he could pray me back to life. I watched my mother pick up the phone. She was calling my Aunt Fatima, asking for a loan. On the other end of the line, I saw Fatima's face. She was surrounded by luxury. Gold jewelry, silk pillows. She was a woman who spoke constantly of family honor and charity. But as my mother pleaded, I saw Fatima's heart. It looked like a piece of dried fruit, shriveled and hard. She told my mother that Allah's will must be respected and that giving money would only interfere with the lesson. It was a pious lie. She just didn't want to diminish her own comfort. This is where the warning becomes your own, Omar, Jesus said. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest, not physical, but a moral agony. I realized that I had done the same thing. I remembered a time, only months ago, when a cousin had asked me for help, and I had used study time as an excuse to protect my own progress. I saw my own reflection in the darkened window of the apartment. My face started to crack like dry clay. I wasn't a victim of the deception. I was a participant in it. The good Muslim boy everyone loved was a mask I wore to hide a heart that was just as calculated as Fatima's. The fracture wasn't in my family. It was in the very core of who I thought I was. I looked at Jesus, and for the first time, I was truly afraid of what he was about to say. Jesus didn't look away from my cracking reflection. He stepped closer until the heat from his presence felt like it was cauterizing the wounds in my pride. The apartment around us began to dissolve, the walls melting into a vast, pressurized expanse that felt like the interior of a star. "You see the fracture, Omar," he said, his voice no longer a whisper but a command that resonated through my very marrow. "You see the debt, the greed, and the hollow prayers. You call it culture or tradition, but I call it a grave whitewashed with gold." I fell to the floor. Not the linoleum of my kitchen, but a floor of pure, transparent glass that looked down into a churning sea of gray faces. "Why?" I gasped, the word tearing at my throat. "Why show me this? I was a good son. I followed the rules." Jesus knelt beside me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of righteous anger in his eyes. Not at me, but at the shadows that had claimed my heart. "The rules were your shield, not your cure," he said. "You used them to hide from me. You used them to judge the man at the gate while you built a palace of correctness in your mind." He pointed toward the sea of faces below. I saw people from every walk of life, imams, priests, tech moguls, and beggars. They were all holding onto the same black threads I had seen in the hospital. "This is the deception," he declared, and the word shook the foundations of the space. "It is the belief that you can negotiate with the truth. It is the lie that says your heritage can substitute for your heart. It happens because men fear the light more than they fear the dark. They prefer a predictable lie to an unpredictable king." I saw the threads begin to tighten, pulling the people closer to a void that looked like absolute loneliness. What changes, Omar, is that the time of the middle ground is ending. The veil is being pulled back, and soon, every man will have to stand in the heat of the sun without a mask. The glass floor vanished, and we were standing in the middle of a massive, modern office building, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling glass and minimalist furniture. I recognized the logo on the wall. It was a global financial firm I had interviewed with for a summer internship. But the people inside were moving in slow motion, their skin translucent. I could see their hearts, and they weren't beating, they were ticking like clocks. "Who is affected?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is it just us?" "Just my family." Jesus walked to the center of the room, and the glass windows shattered outward, though no wind entered. "Everyone who builds on sand is affected," he said. "The deception isn't a religion, Omar. It's a currency. Look." I saw a woman in a sharp power suit talking into a headset. Behind her, a shadow that looked like a distorted version of herself was whispering into her ear, feeding her numbers that were dripping with blood. Every success she celebrated was a theft from someone she would never meet. The deception was a global web, a systemic rot that used the language of progress to justify the crushing of the weak. What determines the outcome? I asked, desperate for a way out, for a formula I could follow. Jesus turned to me, and his face was suddenly filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like it could swallow the world. The outcome is determined by what you love more. The lie that keeps you safe, or the truth that sets you on fire. He reached into the air and pulled out a single, shimmering thread of white light. The deception promises you a seat at the table of the world if you only surrender your soul in small, polite increments. It tells you that 2026 will be a year of recovery, but I tell you it is the year of the harvest. The wheat and the weeds are being separated, and the fire doesn't care about your titles. The mosque of my childhood reappeared. It was quiet, the smell of old wool rugs and rosewater thick in the air. I saw myself, the living Omar, standing at the back of the room. I looked holy. I was bowing at the right times, saying the right words. But in my hand, hidden behind my back, I was holding a small, jagged piece of the black thread. I was using my piety to manipulate my father into giving me more money for books that I actually spent on clothes to impress girls I didn't even like. Jesus stood between the holy Omar and the spirit Omar. This is your fracture, he said. You are the gatekeeper of your own prison. You see the deception in the chaplain, in your aunt, and in the bankers. But do you see it in the mirror? The image of my living self turned around, and his eyes were hollow, filled with the same shimmering oil I had seen in the hospital. It was a direct self-confrontation that felt like being skinned alive. I saw every lie I had ever told, every time I had chosen my reputation over the truth. You have a choice, Omar Al-Sayed, Jesus said. His voice was like a hammer on an anvil. You can go back and keep the thread. You can live the life you planned, the medical degree, the respect of the community, the comfortable lie. Or you can let the thread go and carry the fire. But know this, the fire will burn everything that is not real. It will cost you your father's approval. It will cost you the safety of your traditions. It will make you a stranger in your own house. I looked at my living self, then at the scarred wrists of the man before me. The silence was heavier than the hospital room. My heart, the one that had stopped beating in Michigan, felt like it was trying to kick its way out of my chest. I want the fire, I whispered. The moment the words left my lips, the serene atmosphere of the mosque didn't just fade, it detonated. The glass floor, the ancient mountain, and the weight of the presence vanished into a vacuum of searing physical agony. I wasn't floating anymore. I was being slammed back into a suit of lead and fire. My first sensation was the smell, the metallic tang of dried blood, the sharp sting of rubbing alcohol, and the cloying, sweet scent of floor cleaner. Then came the sound. It wasn't the music of the spheres or the voice of a king. It was the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator and the frantic, high-pitched chirping of a bedside monitor. I tried to gasp, but the plastic tube in my throat turned the effort into a muffled, pathetic wheeze. My eyes snapped open, but the overhead lights were so bright they felt like needles being driven into my retinas. I saw a nurse, a woman with tired eyes and a badge that read Sarah, jump back in genuine shock. He's bucking the vent. She screamed, her voice cutting through the clinical haze. He's awake. Page Dr. Eris now. I felt the cold plastic of the endotracheal tube sliding against my vocal cords as I gagged. It was a visceral, disgusting reminder that I was back in a world where things break, bleed, and rot. My hand, which had passed through the water glass just hours, or lifetimes, ago, now felt impossibly heavy. I tried to lift it, to reach for the tube, but my wrist was tied to the bed rail with a soft blue restraint. The safety of the hospital felt like a cage. I looked at the heart monitor and saw the jagged green line of my pulse. It was erratic, jumping with the terror of my return. I wasn't the good Muslim boy who had fallen asleep. I was a stranger inhabiting a broken body. Through the small window in the ICU door, I saw my father's face. He looked relieved, weeping and clutching his beads, but all I could see was the oily, gray vapor I knew was still swirling in the hallway. Recovery wasn't a miracle. It was a slow, grinding torture. 3 days after I woke up, the doctors were still calling my survival statistically improbable. I was sitting up, the tube finally gone, leaving my voice a raspy, broken shell. My Aunt Fatima came to visit. just as I had seen in the vision. She walked in with a tray of expensive sweets and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned over and kissed my forehead, her gold bracelets clinking against each other, a sound that now sounded like a funeral bell. "Allah has been so merciful to us, Omar," she whispered, her voice dripping with the pious tone I now recognized as a weapon. "We prayed so hard. I even made a special donation in your name to ensure your recovery." I looked at her, and the hospital room seemed to dim. I didn't see the gold or the silk scarf. I saw the shriveled, dry fruit of her heart. "Was the donation for me, Auntie?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Or was it to make sure the neighbors knew how much you spent?" The air in the room turned ice cold. Her smile didn't fade, but it hardened into a mask. She pulled back, her eyes narrowing in a way that confirmed everything. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked if the medication was making me disrespectful. That afternoon, my father came in looking haunted. He sat at the foot of my bed, avoiding my gaze. "The shop is having some trouble, Omar," he said, picking at a loose thread on the hospital blanket. "I had to take a loan to cover the extra costs of the specialists." I felt the weight of the deception Jesus had warned me about. The specialist my father spoke of wasn't a doctor. It was the same local leader I had seen in the vision, the one with the black box. My father had traded our family's future for a blessing that was actually a debt. The financial fracture was no longer a vision. It was a registered letter sitting on his nightstand at home. By the time I was discharged, the world felt like it was vibrating on a frequency I alone could hear. I walked out of Beaumont Hospital on a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, the Michigan summer finally beginning to break. My father was pulling the car around, and I stood on the sidewalk, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I reached into my pocket and felt something sharp. I pulled it out, expecting a stray piece of medical tape or a coin. It was a small, jagged splinter of charred wood. It looked like it had been pulled from a fire that had been extinguished centuries ago, yet when I touched it, it was warm, impossibly warm. I looked at my wrist, the one that had been restrained in the ICU. There was a mark there that wasn't from the soft blue cuff. It was a faint, white scar, shaped like a crater, identical to the one I had seen on the man with the furnace eyes. It wasn't a medical scar, it was a brand. As I climbed into the passenger seat of my father's rusted sedan, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Youssef, the friend from the soccer field. "Hey man, glad you're alive. Listen, the community is throwing a huge dinner for your miracle. Everyone's going to be there. The leaders want you to speak about how your faith saved you. It's going to be great for the scholarship fund." I looked at my father, who was smiling at me with a desperate, hollow hope, then back at the text. I felt the splinter of wood burning against my palm. I knew then that the miracle they wanted was a lie, and the truth I carried would cost me the only home I had ever known. I didn't reply. I just watched the gray vapor rise from the exhaust of the car in front of us.